coordinated threat enters Harlem under cover of bravado and reputation. 12 men arrive believing numbers equal power. Bumpy Johnson receives the insult without movement, already measuring consequences. Night settled over Harlem like a held breath. 12 men cross the avenue together, coats tight, hats low, moving with the confidence of borrowed reputation. They were not locals. Locals walked softer. They entered a room already claimed. Smoke hung unmoving. Cards stayed on the table. Conversations did not stop. They simply bent away from the doorway. Everyone knew who the message was for. Bumpy Johnson did not look up at first. He listened. Shoes, weight, fear disguised as bravado. He understood the kind of men who traveled in groups, mistaking numbers for protection. He let them stand there longer than comfort allowed. The spokesman stepped forward. His words were practiced, sharpened elsewhere, carried in like contraband, a demand, a warning, a name spoken with. Disrespect, as if volume could replace authority. Dutch Schultz wanted Harlem to be reminded of who paid for arrogance. Bumpy finally raised his eyes. No anger, no surprise, just recognition, the way a judge recognizes a verdict already decided. He studied each face not as threats, but as consequences. He spoke quietly, a few words, enough to acknowledge receipt of the insult, enough to confirm it had landed exactly where intended. Outside, the street waited. People paused mid-step, sensing pressure in the air without knowing why. Harlem had learned long ago to read silence better than noise. The 12 men believed this was still a negotiation. They believed walking in together meant walking out together. Bumpy Johnson remained seated, hands folded, patience intact. The night had delivered its message. Now the night would carry his response. No one moved yet, but every man understood time had narrowed, and choices would soon demand blood or obedience from this room alone. Harlem did not announce loyalty. It lived it. Morning came slowly, rolling through the streets like a careful witness. Storekeepers lifted gates without hurry. Men on corners spoke less than usual. Women leaned from windows longer than normal, watching nothing and everything at once. Word had not traveled yet, but feelings had. Harlem could sense when its balance was being tested. Bumpy Johnson moved through it without escort. He never needed one. Heads turned, not in awe, but in acknowledgement. Respect did not rush toward him. It stood firm and waited. He stopped where he always did, spoke to the same faces, asked about mothers, about sons, about businesses that needed quiet protection instead of loud promises. His authority did not come from fear. Fear was clumsy. It left marks. Bumpy's power came from memory, from debts paid without being spoken, from lines never crossed because everyone knew who stood behind them. The 12 men had not understood this. They saw. Territory numbers profit. Outsiders always did. They mistook Harlem for a market instead of a family. Bumpy listened more than he spoke that day. Listening kept a man alive longer than words. He heard which doors closed too early, which voices lowered when his name passed between them. Harlem was not afraid. It was alert. Children ran past him without stopping. Old men nodded without standing. That was how deep it went. No ceremony, no performance, only structure. By afternoon, he sat in a back room, light coming through dirty glass. Men came to him one at a time, not to ask permission, to offer presents, to remind him that whatever line was being tested, it was not his alone. He sent most of them away. Too many bodies made noise. Noise brought eyes. Eyes brought misunderstanding. Bumpy preferred clarity. He thought of the message again. 12 men were sent to speak loudly where quiet ruled. That alone was an insult. Dutch Schultz did not know Harlem. Worse, he did not respect it. Bumpy felt no urgency. Urgency belonged to men who feared losing something. Harlem was not something he held. It was something he carried. When evening returned, the streets breathed easier. They trusted him to choose the moment. They trusted him not to flinch. Harlem had survived louder men than Dutch Schultz. It would survive him too. What mattered now was not whether violence would come, but how contained it would be, how precise, how final. Bumpy Johnson walked into the night as he always did, unhurried, unchallenged, already knowing that when the response arrived, Harlem would recognize it as correction, not chaos. Pressure rarely announces itself. It leans, it waits. It applies weight where men think they are strongest. Dutch Schultz applied his from a distance. He believed distance made him untouchable. Orders traveled better than bullets. Pride traveled best of all. He sent more than 12 men. He sent expectations. The expectation that Harlem would fold, that Bumpy Johnson would recognize louder ambition and step aside. The pressure came in small ways first. Deliveries delayed. Rumors whispered too carefully to feel accidental. Men who had never spoken Schultz's name suddenly spoke it twice, then went quiet. These were not threats. They were tests. Bumpy did not respond. That was what unsettled them. He allowed the pressure to accumulate, the way a man allows steam to build when he wants the release to be decisive. He watched which businesses felt the squeeze. He watched who panicked too quickly and who waited for instruction. Harlem revealed its weak joints when leaned on. Bumpy memorized them, not for punishment, but for protection. He met with no one publicly, no statements, no gestures meant for outside ears. Those expecting a show mistook silence for hesitation. They were wrong. The men Dutch sent back were sharper than the first, quieter, less confident. They asked questions instead of making demands. That told Bumpy everything. The authority that asked was already unsure of itself. They spoke of compromise, of shared interests, of peace dressed up as generosity. Bumpy listened without comment, letting the words exhaust themselves. He knew peace offered under pressure was just surrender, waiting for a better moment. He answered with restraint. Harlem was not for sale, not in pieces, not temporarily. The men left without understanding whether they had been dismissed or spared. Outside the lines, Dutch Schultz grew impatient. Impatience makes men careless. Carelessness makes them visible. He wanted speed. Speed required force. That was the mistake. Pressure tightened. Someone got bold in the wrong place. A voice raised where it should not have been. A stare held too long. Harlem noticed. Harlem always noticed. Bumpy did not intervene immediately. He let the community feel the imbalance. Power that moves too fast breaks what it tries to control. He wanted this corrected, not inflamed. By the time night returned, everyone understood the pressure was no longer theoretical. The line was being stepped on deliberately now. Dutch Schultz was no longer testing. He was pushing. Bumpy Johnson stood at the center of it, unmoved. He had allowed the enemy close enough to expose intent, close enough to commit. That was the difference between reaction and judgment. Pressure from outside only mattered when it entered the room. And soon it would. Not as a negotiation, as a mistake that would demand resolution. Disrespect, when done privately, could sometimes be corrected quietly. When done in public, it demanded memory. It happened in the open, where Harlem's eyes were already trained. A place meant for conversation, not confrontation. The men arrived again, fewer this time, but louder. They chose visibility on purpose. They wanted witnesses. They wanted to turn restraint into weakness. They spoke his name without care, not as a warning now, but as a challenge. They leaned where they should have stood straight. They laughed where silence had always been currency. Every move was intentional, designed to redraw lines that had been settled long ago. Bumpy Johnson was not present. That was part of the insult. Word traveled fast, carried not by messengers but by offense. Storefronts closed early. Music dimmed. People did not scatter. They stayed. Communities stay when they expect judgment, not chaos. By the time Bumpy arrived, the noise had already thinned, not because the men stopped talking, but because no one answered them anymore. Harlem had withdrawn its attention. That withdrawal was heavier than anger. Bumpy entered without announcement. The chairs shifted, breaths adjusted. The men noticed too late. They straightened instinctively, like boys remembering discipline they thought they'd outgrown. He did not address them immediately. He acknowledged the room first. Eyes met him. Small nods passed. A network reaffirmed itself without a word spoken. Then he turned to the men. They tried to speak first. They always did at this stage. Talking was how they convinced themselves they still had control. They mentioned names, numbers, consequences that would come if compliance did not. Bumpy let them finish. Let the silence stretch afterward until their words collapsed under their own weight. Public disrespect had rules. Once committed, it could not be erased, only answered. He reminded them calmly where they stood. Not geographically, historically. Harlem had not been claimed by noise or threats. It had been built through understanding, protected by patience, enforced only when necessary. They laughed again, softer this time. Laughter meant to save face. Laughter meant for each other, not him. That was when Bumpy's voice lowered. He did not threaten. Threats were for men unsure of outcome. He explained consequence the way one explains gravity, not personal, not emotional, simply unavoidable. The room absorbed it. Harlem listened. Outsiders rarely did. One of the men made a final mistake, a step forward. A word said too quickly. Disrespect doubled down, hoping momentum could replace wisdom. Bumpy stood then, slowly, purposefully. No one blocked him. No one spoke. The correction did not happen there. That mattered. Public disrespect deserved private resolution, but public memory. The men were allowed to leave, allowed to believe they still had agency. Harlem knew better. By morning, everyone understood the line had been crossed beyond repair. What came next would not be loud. It would not be immediate, but it would be precise enough to echo, longer than gunfire. Bumpy Johnson did not rush correction. He allowed anticipation to do half the work. Fear grows best in silence, and silence was something Harlem obeyed without instruction. The moment did not arrive with chaos. It arrived with order. Night folded itself neatly around the place they chose. Not public, not hidden, neutral, ground, where men believed rules were flexible. The kind of place where bravado usually outlived wisdom. The men came first, confident again. Laughter returned too early. They believed the delay meant hesitation. They believed restraint meant fear. That belief was the last thing they shared. Bumpy Johnson arrived alone. No entourage, no announcement, just presence. The room felt it before eyes confirmed it. Conversations broke apart mid-sentence. Chairs scraped softly as men recalculated where to place their bodies. He stood without removing his coat. That detail mattered. It meant he was not staying long. The spokesman spoke again. I tried humor this time, tried familiarity. He mentioned Dutch Schultz's name like it carried weight here, like it could tilt the room. Bumpy did not respond immediately. He looked at each man once, count them, measured distance. He had already decided who would walk and who would not. He spoke quietly, so they had to lean in to hear him. That learning was submission before they understood it. He said the message had been received, that the insult had been acknowledged, that the misunderstanding would now be corrected. No shouting followed, no drawn-out confrontation. The correction was swift, controlled, exact. Violence used like punctuation, ending the sentence, not decorating it. The men did not have time to understand how wrong they had been. They only understood when movement became impossible, when certainty collapsed, when fear finally arrived too late to be useful. One man was spared, intentionally, deliberately. Bumpy made sure he watched, made sure he understood why he was still breathing. When it was over, Bumpy straightened his coat. No celebration, no lingering. He did not look back at what remained on the floor. Consequences did not require witnesses once delivered. The spared man was told to leave, given a simple instruction, to carry what he had seen back to where arrogance lived. He left shaking, alive, burdened with knowledge heavier than guilt. By the time the night exhaled, Harlem already knew. Not details, not numbers, just an outcome. Only one walked out. Bumpy Johnson did not speak of it afterward. He never needed to. Calm domination does not echo through boasts. It settles into memory, into behavior, into silence where challenges once formed. The message was complete. Not to Dutch Schultz alone, but to anyone who mistook restraint for weakness or community for territory. Morning did not bring celebration. It never did after moments like this. Harlem woke the way it always had, careful, observant, respectful of what the night had settled. The place where it happened was already quiet. Too quiet. No questions were asked out loud. No one needed to ask. Harlem had learned long ago that survival depended on understanding outcomes, not replaying scenes. Details created rumors. Rumors attracted attention. Attention brought outsiders who never understood context. What mattered was simple. Only one walked out. That fact moved through the neighborhood like a steady current. Not fast, not loud, certain. Store owners adjusted nothing. Children still ran on the sidewalks. Old men still took their seats. Life continued because order had been preserved, not disrupted. That was the difference. Bumpy Johnson did not appear that day. He didn't need to. His absence was not avoidance, it was confidence. Power, once exercised correctly, does not linger around its own reflection. Those closest to him understood what had really happened. This had not been about Dutch Schultz alone. Schultz was a name, a symptom, a reminder of what happened when men believed reach mattered more than roots. The correction was aimed wider than one man's ambition. Harlem belonged to itself. The man who walked out carried that understanding with him, like a wound that never closed. He spoke carefully afterward. He chose his words as if they might turn on him. He did not embellish. He did not boast. Fear had stripped him of the need to impress anyone ever again. Dutch Schultz listened, not fully. Men like him rarely did, but he adjusted. Loud men always did after quiet lessons. Retreat didn't mean respect, but it meant distance. And the distance was enough. Bumpy returned later, moving through Harlem as he always had, Same pace, same posture, same acknowledgement exchanged in silence. No one thanked him. No one congratulated him. Gratitude would have cheapened the moment. What he had done was not heroism, it was maintenance. He checked on families affected by the pressure. He corrected disruptions caused by outside hands. He reminded his people that protection was a responsibility, not a favor. Power was not something you displayed. It was something you carried carefully so others didn't have to. Years later, men would tell the story wrong. They would add noise, add numbers, add fury that had never existed. That was inevitable. Stories grow loud when they leave the streets that created them. Harlem remembered it differently. They remembered the waiting. They remembered the silence. They remembered how nothing spilled over. No innocent blood, no chaos, no war, just a correction. Bumpy Johnson's legacy was never about how many men fell. It was about how many didn't have to, how many businesses stayed open, how many children grew up without learning the sound of panic as a language. That night became part of Harlem's foundation, laid quietly beneath the pavement, not as a warning, but as reassurance, a reminder that leadership did not require spectacle, that restraint could be sharper than rage. Long after the names faded, long after the rivalries collapsed under their own weight, the principle remained. Do not mistake silence for weakness. Do not mistake community for opportunity. Do not test what has already proven it knows how to end a conversation. That was what Harlem remembered. That was Bumpy Johnson.